Before I begin my sermon on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today, I have a quick confession to make to all of you. I am not black. Shocker, I know, for some of you. The reason I share this somewhat obvious information with you is simply to humbly acknowledge that the racial struggles I will be addressing this morning, they are not mine. The great struggle belongs primarily, exclusively really, to the Black American community. I can in no way fully understand the unique pain and sacrifice involved in the African American struggle for justice, for equality, and for freedom in this country. So when I reference that struggle today, please know that I'm keenly aware of this fact. Nevertheless, I do stand here today proudly as a non-Black ally, and as an ally and as an American, I know that I do have a part to play in this continuing struggle. We all have a part to play, regardless of our skin color. But I think it's important for us to remember that our parts are different. My sermon today, a sermon being delivered by a non-Black man to a predominantly white UU congregation, is not an attempt to appropriate that struggle. The proper role for me and other non-Black allies is a supporting role, not the leading role. So please know that any suggestions or observations I make today are within that context. 50 years ago, we heard the masterful articulation of a powerful dream. A new dream for its time, but as noted by its prophetic dreamer, a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. It was a dream, a vision of the future of this country, one that foretold a peaceful, harmonious future America finally at peace with itself and its racist past. But sometimes in remembering the telling of that dream 50 years ago, we elevate the end result, the beautiful, idyllic image of little Black boys and Black girls joining hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. And we conveniently forget the many steps towards justice, the journey through the gates of hell it would take for us as a nation to get there. We sometimes forget the many steps those before us have already taken, and we often ignore the many steps that still lie before us to make this dream a reality. But we shall overcome, all of us, together. It's a prophetic declaration, one I believe will someday come to pass, but the greatest threat to its ultimate fulfillment is a false narrative propagated by enemies of justice, namely that we have already overcome. And so the battle is over. And so vigilance is no longer required, struggle is no longer required, sacrifice is no longer required. That lie of premature success, that lie that justice and equality have already been secured, that lie of a false peace is a tempting one, but one that we who dedicate ourselves to the work of justice must resist. Today we honor the accomplishments and sacrifices of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and all those who strove and sacrificed with him to make that dream a reality. And much has already changed in this world as a direct result of Dr. King's work. The Civil Rights Act, the desegregation of the South, the Voter Rights Act that safeguarded the right to vote for Black Americans, the sea change in racial attitudes that have occurred in just a couple of generations. You know, I am still amazed and grateful to know that the very idea of racism, the idea that one group of people, simply because of the color of their skin, is somehow superior or inferior to another group of people, that idea is completely foreign and frankly rather idiotic to my daughters. These are significant accomplishments and signs that 50 years later, Dr. King's dream is moving closer to reality. The change has occurred, and we should rightfully rejoice over that fact. But we are all also aware of the truth in that old adage, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In several very important ways, we have seen no change in this country whatsoever. According to the Pew Research Center, in the 50 years since Dr. King articulated his dream, the racial economic gap, the economic gulf between whites and blacks has not changed. Despite 50 years since the Civil Rights Act passed, the gap between white and blacks on measures like home ownership and poverty have not narrowed a whit. And the gap between blacks and whites when it comes to average household income and average household wealth has actually increased over the past 50 years. And in 2015, we are still wrestling with the demon of racially motivated police brutality and prosecutorial negligence that allows that brutality to continue. You may recall that in the middle of his "I Have a Dream" speech, Dr. King notes, there are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? Dr. King then gives an answer. He actually gives 5 concrete answers, 5 requirements he believes must be met before he will be satisfied that civil rights have been achieved. And the very first reply he gives in that list of 5 is this: we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We so desperately want to believe that we as a nation have already overcome this demon. But names like Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and Tamir Rice remind us that we haven't progressed quite as far as we would like to believe. The more things change. Now, there are some very good, caring, and intelligent people who will argue that in any of the 3 cases I just listed, there's no way to prove definitively that racism was a factor. For example, I personally know several good people who argue the killing of Michael Brown and the failure of the grand jury in Ferguson to hand down an indictment was not racially motivated. It is a plausible conclusion because, frankly, there are several facts regarding Brown's killing that we can never know with any sort of metaphysical certainty. But there are certain other facts behind the incident, around the incident, that do help explain the angst and anger and frustration and rage of the black residents in Ferguson, Missouri, because no incident, the killing of Michael Brown included, no such incident ever happens in a vacuum. The population of Ferguson is 69% black, only 29% white, yet the mayor of Ferguson is white. 5 of the 6 city council members of Ferguson are white. 6 of the 7 school board members of Ferguson are white. The police chief of Ferguson is white. 50 of 53 police officers in Ferguson are white. In St. Louis County, 47% of black men aged 18 to 24 are unemployed. 3 times as many blacks live in poverty there as do whites. It is always possible to look at individual examples of alleged police brutality like the Michael Brown case in a vacuum and use reason or logic to conclude that explicit personal racism was not necessarily a motivating factor. But explicit personal racism is no longer the most prevalent nor the most dangerous form of racism in America in 2015. It is the institutionalized racism embedded in our culture and power structures, Ferguson, Missouri being just one example that is the most pervasive and the most insidious. The cases of Brown, Garner, and Rice, the racial power imbalance in places like Ferguson, Missouri, the widening economic gap between whites and blacks, these all strongly suggest that Dr. King's dream is still just that, a dream, and not a reality. I think it is important to note that in the shadow of Dr. King's dream came an ominous report from the US federal government in 1968. That report came from what has come to be known as the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission was established by President Lyndon B. Johnson to investigate the causes of the 1967 race riots. For those who may not be aware, in 1967, 126 US cities were hit by racial violence, with 75 incidents classified as major race riots. The Kerner Commission report famously concluded the following: our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. The decade of the 1960s left all of us Americans with two competing predictions for the future: Dr. King's dream and the Kerner Commission report. Which will win? I believe our faith as Unitarian Universalists compels us to fight for the dream, and it is a fight. I know we often associate Dr. King with nonviolence, but that doesn't mean he wasn't a fighter. I fear that sometimes, because of the beautiful image of racial harmony he shared with the world during the March on Washington, and because of his physically nonviolent methodology, we forget sometimes the often confrontational, aggressive, and frankly revolutionary tone and content of his speeches. King fought, just not with fists. He fought with words. And through those words, he did great violence to systems of racial oppression and injustice in this country. In his pursuit of justice, when he saw the scales of justice unbalanced, when he saw evil, he didn't seek compromise or conciliation. He blasted a trumpet and brought a spotlight upon that evil. He brought shame and scorn and disgrace down upon the heads of the guilty. He wasn't simply seeking to heal wounds between the races or suggest that victims simply ignore and forgive the injustices they had suffered. Yes, he wanted to unite blacks and whites, but he did not seek peace at any cost, not if the cost was sacrificing justice and allowing black Americans to continue to live as second-class citizens. Dr. King knew there can be no true peace without justice and equality. So, how can we, as UUs, as the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville, how can we continue to fight for that dream? This morning, I have 3 concrete steps you can take, and which you can take almost immediately. 1, join us for the city's MLK March tomorrow morning. Now, will marching in this parade change laws? Will it end institutional racism in this country or this city? No. But it will be a powerful symbol to Jacksonville's black community that Unitarian Universalists stand in solidarity with them. And this march this year may be the most important year for us to make that public show of support and solidarity. I really believe that something is happening in this country right now. We may be at the step of the next great civil rights movement right here and right now. Don't stand on the sidelines. Number 2, contact your local Florida State House and State House and Senate representatives and tell them to support Bill number 57. Bill number 57. That bill, if passed, will put body cameras on all law enforcement officers in the state of Florida. It is Bill number 57 in both the Senate and the House. Number 3, the third thing you can do, get involved with iCare. I can't stress that enough. Make plans now to come to the Nehemiah Assembly this year on April 20th. Put it in your calendars. Put it in your cell phones. By showing up there, filling those seats, we will be putting pressure on our city leaders to make real changes in the lives of thousands in this city. The initiatives that iCare pursues this year, they're not explicitly directed toward the black community, but we know that by increasing reading rates in low-performing schools, by building wealth and jobs in Northwest Jacksonville, by expanding services to the homeless, and most importantly, in my opinion, by enacting restorative justice for youth and ending the school-to-prison pipeline, we will be helping to tear down the power structures of institutionalized racism in this city. And if you'll give me a moment, I would like to focus on that school-to-prison pipeline for just a second. It needs to be destroyed for several reasons. But one in particular that I personally hadn't really thought much about until I watched the movie Selma this week. One of the most precious rights possessed by citizens of the United States of America is the right to vote. Dr. King's Selma campaign was dedicated to helping secure and ensure the right of black citizens in the South to vote. But that right is under attack again in 2015. And the primary weapon being used to attack the right of black Americans to vote is called felony disenfranchisement. In several states, including Florida, an individual convicted of a felony can lose his right to vote. Nationally, black Americans are 4 times more likely to lose their right to vote through felony disenfranchisement than whites. Currently, 38% of those who have lost the right to vote in this fashion are black, even though blacks only make up less than 13% of the general population. Nationally, 1 in 13 black Americans has been stripped of his right to vote through this policy. 1 in 13 nationally, but in the state of Florida, it is 1 in 5. 20% of black Americans in the state of Florida has lost the right to vote because of this policy. This practice of felony disenfranchisement is racist. I have no problem standing up here and saying that. It belongs in the same category as the poll taxes and literacy tests of the Jim Crow era. Until we can pass legislation that outright ends this racist practice in the state of Florida, the only other option facing us is to find ways to change the system so that people, especially young black Americans, have a fair opportunity to avoid falling into that school to prison pipeline in the first place. Restorative justice is a powerful tool to make that happen. It is an I Care initiative, so please, I am asking you, I am begging you, if you can make it, come to the Nehemiah Assembly on April 20th. These are 3 steps we can all plan to take right now. We cannot afford to delay in our pursuit of justice. Dr. King once famously echoed the sentiments of Unitarian minister Theodore Parker when he recognized that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. However, Dr. King also recognized that there was no moral justification to delay in seeking or obtaining justice. I conclude today with these words that Dr. King gifted us from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the March on Washington. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. Blessed be.